My advice to the Ukrainians, the longer they fight, the less of Ukraine will remain for them.
The Trump-Putin conversation concluded. It was a very long conversation. A lot has transpired between the United States of America and Russia when it comes to Ukraine since President Trump took over. What is the way forward? What's really happening on the ground? To discuss all this and more, I'm being joined in an exclusive conversation with politician, Member of Parliament, political scientist, and a part of the news industry, Mr. Vyacheslav Nikonov, who is a prominent member of a Russian political spectrum, so to say. Thank you so much for joining us here on India Today.
Okay.
It was a long conversation, 2.5. We've listed out a lot of the long conversations that President Putin has had with U.S. presidents. This, by far, is one of the longest. What, according to you, really transpired in terms of a way forward? We know that they discussed ceasefire, they discussed details on how to go forward on Ukraine. There are red lines that have been set by Russia. But what do you think is the way forward?
First of all, I'd like to say that is not the longest conversation of the presidents between of Russia and the United States, because Putin met many American presidents, and they spent sometimes days talking in Camp David nearby Moscow. So sometimes and really it takes days to discuss serious problems, and I should stress that is the second telephone conversation of the presidents of Russia and the United States in 3 years, but it's also the second in 2 weeks, so that makes a difference. And I think in the next couple of weeks there'll be another telephone call. What I think is the most important is the fact of the conversation in itself, because that is the resumption of dialogue between Russia and the United States, which was non-existent for 3 years, which I think was not wise. That was not on our initiative, but Americans decided to stop whatever negotiations, talks with Russia on any issues. I'm actually in the Russian State Duma responsible for the group of friendship with the U.S. Congress. And I was absolutely jobless for those 3 years. Just still am jobless. There are no contacts on at the congressional level. Another important thing, we resumed diplomatic contacts. Actually, the Russian ambassador couldn't get an agreement for quite a while, and actually tomorrow he's leaving for the United States. Finally, and that means some diplomatic issues and channels will be activated in the process. Thirdly, what's important, they agreed to set a working group. Maybe we'll let them fly. Thirdly, what is most important, I think, is that they agreed to settle a working group on Ukraine. But by far, I think there were no negotiations on Ukraine. They were just talking on what should be done to start serious talk. And it looks like on Sunday, there will be talks in Saudi Arabia between the American delegation headed by, say, Secretary Rubio and National Security Advisor Waltz. On the Russian side, I think will be their counterparts, Ushakov and Lavrov. And they will work on details on the ceasefire. Because for Russia, of course, ceasefire is all right, but there are some nuances, as Putin puts it. And the nuances are who's going to monitor it, who will make the orders, and what will happen in 30 days of this truce. If they are used to weaponize Ukraine, that's something we are not interested in. we'd better go on. Russia is not in a hurry in this situation. It's the Ukrainian and American side which is interested in ceasefire much more than Russia at this point.
Mr. Nikonov, in terms of the ceasefire itself, do you think at the border, I was speaking to a few of the European ministers and leaders, they're saying at the border there has to be an acceptable agreement on who's going to man that border to ensure ceasefire. Would you be, or would Russia be okay having foreign forces, Europeans, United Nations, any of the international organizations on the ground?
The quick answer is no. Of course, not NATO, because as you well know, for Russia, one of the reasons to start this special military operation was potential Ukrainian membership in NATO. NATO forces in Ukraine is no better than Ukraine in NATO. So that is out of the question. These NATO troops on Ukrainian soil will be a legitimate target for the Russian armed forces. That's as simple as that. As for the United Nations, depends on what is the United Nations forces. If they include some NATO forces, it's again out of the questions. I don't think there will be need for any. If the desire to have a ceasefire is sincere, there is no need for that. But I would not accept theoretically some situation when some peacekeepers might be needed. And then, of course, Indian forces will be preferable to many others.
That's very interesting. That's an interesting take. But in terms of resolution to the entire crisis right now that exists at the Russian borders, how is Russia looking at the land that has now been taken by Russia? Is that going to be? Will that remain under Russian control? Will there be a compromise where some would be given, some would be taken? How do you envisage this would work?
Well, first of all, when the conflict began, we already agreed with Ukraine that there will be no Russian territorial claims. But we also, when they continued fighting and decided on the advice of the British and Americans to continue the war till the last Ukrainians, that's what Europeans, I think, want now. The consequences will be the loss of territory populated by Russians who voted on referendum to be part of Russia. And that's what they did. Of course, Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, these are regions which are constitutionally Russian. It's in the Russian constitution, they're there, due to the expressed will of the people living there. Of course, they're Russians.
So the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant now is out of the question of ever being handed over. Was that a historical mistake?
It's not on the table. Actually, if we go long back in history, first of all, I'd like to say that Russia and Ukraine is just one nation. Actually, the language differences, which are minor, by the way, they're probably smaller than between Germans living in the east and west of Germany. They merged when the eastern part of Kievan Rus were under the Mongols, and the western part was part of the Lithuanian kingdom. So that's when the difference came. And then there was a reunification in the 17th century, and there is again one state for many centuries. And actually, the eastern areas of Ukraine
Are Russian speaking.
They're Russian speaking, absolutely, because they were added to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic inside the Soviet Union by Lenin, who thought that Ukraine should have some proletariat. And there was no proletariat on the Ukrainian lands. There was no industry. So they added some industrial Russian areas to Ukraine. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, no one cared about the borders. We didn't have the borders. We didn't think that there will be borders. But unfortunately, the Ukrainian government was becoming more and more nationalist, and then showed up all the American NGOs, which you well aware what they're doing, and that what they were doing, they were just parting Ukraine away from Russia. Read Brzezinski and others.
So the accusation or the allegation by the West is that Russia has has an imperialistic mindset, and that they are going to take over Ukraine, and that they're going to expand further. Is that the plan? Is Ukraine going to be part of Russia completely, or just the paths that have been taken? And is there a plan to go further westward?
Well, my advice to the Ukrainians: the longer they fight, the less of Ukraine will remain for them. That's as simple as that, because there are still many Russian-speaking areas there. And Russia had no intention of, having this land inside. But of course, now we're not going to give up after so many people died. And the sacrifice was great. And actually, we were there in a large extent to protect the Russians who were shelled for 8 years by Ukrainian forces for being secessionists, though they had also their right to self-determination. Actually, Russia is oftentimes accused of violating the international law. But in international law, there are two conflicting principles: self-determination of nations and, of course, territorial integrity. So when they accuse Russia, they stress territorial integrity. But I should remind you that when the United Nations were settled in 1945, there were only 50 nations there. And now there are 193. So 143 nations actually were added on the principle of national self-determination. And actually, Ukraine was also express a right to self-determination, because being part of the Soviet Union, they decided to split, and they were given this right. And the people living in eastern Ukraine, who has no Ukrainian identity whatsoever, they have their right to self-determination, and they expressed it on their referendum. And in each of the four, actually 5 if you had the Crimea areas, the vote for being part of Russia was overwhelming, well over 90%.
So is Dnieper going to be the natural boundary? Is that how it's looking right now?
No,
or
not.
Are we looking beyond Dnieper?
It's not looking right now. Dnieper is well to the west of the nowadays borders of the constitutional borders of the Russian Federation. But if Ukraine persists, that may be.
Okay, Mr. Nikonov, this is a very rare format. We've seen, not that it hasn't happened before, but it's rare that you have conversations happening for a truce between US and Russia, and then between US and Ukraine. Is there a moment where we will see President Zelensky sit across the table with President Putin, or that's a no-go? That for President Putin, it's not an acceptable format.
It's possible Putin is talking to whoever wants to talk to Putin. The problem with Zelensky that he legally, by his own decree and then by law, prohibits himself from negotiating with Russians. So it's illegal for him to negotiate with Russians. So first of all, they need to cancel that law. Another thing is that his legitimacy is definitely under question for Putin, sure, because his term of presidency expired long ago, and they didn't have any presidential election. So Zelensky is regarded in Moscow now as an illegitimate president. There is a legitimate power of the Rada, the parliament, and Russia would support presidential election if Zelensky is re-elected, which I doubt. He will be the partner.
You think if there are elections held in the future, that the opposition will get the kind of space that they should or they deserve in Ukraine? Would Yanukovych return to fight the elections? How does it work?
I think Yanukovych is fine in Sochi, he will not come back for sure. And I would not expect any pro-Russian candidate winning in today's Ukraine. Ukraine now is a tough dictatorial state with no pluralism, no freedom of expression. In public opinion polls they make are just laughable because, there are some alternative Western public opinion polls which show a very different picture. Zelensky considers himself to be the most popular Ukrainian, which is definitely not the case.
Final question to you. What are the key takeaways that from the conversation that you must have read about between Trump and Putin?
Most important that they will continue. And most important that peace is now visible. We can see how that can happen. It's also important for me to understand that Trump understands Russian awarenesses. Trump was well prepared for this conversation, probably by Mr. Witkoff, who spent more time with Putin than Trump last night. They spoke for more than 3.5 hours, and I think they discussed all the details. Trump knows that a Russian agreement on ceasefire would not be unconditional, and he works on conditions with Ukrainians. From what we hear from the Ukrainians, including what we heard yesterday from the foreign minister of Ukraine, here they're not prepared to take those conditions. But since Ukraine is not too sovereign, to put it mildly, and that Americans have some leverage, which we saw in the White House not so long ago, they can be convincing for Ukrainians.
But will Putin accept the minerals deals that U.S. wants to cut with Ukraine? Is that unacceptable? Because it'll be part of the entire conversation.
Well, to be honest, I don't think there are any minerals left in Ukraine. And most of the minerals they have are already in the territories controlled by the Russian Federation. So if Americans want those, we are open to conversations. And actually, Trump, after his speech talk with Putin, said that Americans are very much interested in Russian minerals, since we have much, much more than Ukraine in terms of minerals.
On that note, Vyacheslav Nikonov, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global. Indeed a pleasure. Thank you.